But yeah.
Okay, so maybe we can think a little bit about what we'd like to discuss with everyone over the next 45 minutes, or maybe even longer, depending on who stays.
I definitely wanted to talk about the model laws for DAOs. Maybe you can walk us through that concept and why we have that. What do you think?
Okay. Would anyone like to? Does anyone immediately have something to say about that? Or I mean, I can give a little bit of an overview as well.
I have a question, which is, have you decided what it's for yet?
When you say what it's for, as in, like, do you mean who is the target audience for who will adopt it, or whether it's for DAOs or not?
Well, just anything about it, like what, yeah.
Yeah. So
who do you think will use it and how?
So actually, that's funny, because I think maybe I should preface a few my comments for those who aren't familiar with this. But basically, the idea has been for quite some time during 2020, and actually, like, the idea predates 2020 as well. But we've been working a lot on this during 2020 for developing a model law that is able to have DAOs, so decentralized autonomous organizations, recognized by multiple legal systems. So by recognized, I mean, like, firstly, like, the legal personality of DAOs being recognized, but then going further than this and thinking about what conditions do DAOs need to fulfill for them to, for instance, enjoy limited liability. And the reason what Chris is asking, and this has been like a controversy or something that we've been discussing at length throughout, and it's actually still, I would imagine, not completely settled, is whether it should be about creating a new legal entity form from scratch. So something like, if you wanted to create a new type of limited liability company, or is it simply that you have this reality, that you have this decentralized autonomous organization, and you want state systems to recognize the legal personality, however it is constructed? And what's interesting for those of you who come from a legal background is that one of these ways of approaching the question is more, I guess, from corporate law, and the other one is more from private international law and perhaps even public international law. And that's been, like, there's been a lot of to and fro about what is more plausible, because you have, for instance, examples like the creation of the Simplified Stock Corporation by the Organization of American States, which is an example where you have, like, this model corporate form where you have all of the rules from the registration of the entity all the way to liquidation being specified in a model law, and you give this to states, and that they can adopt it and have any gaps in that model law filled by local corporate law. So that's one approach to trying to create these entities. The other approach is where you're not as prescriptive, but you give a sort of broader outline of what kind of criteria a DAO needs to fulfill for it then to be functional in certain jurisdictions by, for instance, being able to appoint a legal representative, being able to sue if it needs to, being able to rent property, and so on. And there's an argument about whether one is more plausible than the other. And right now, I think so far the way that the model law is shaping up is more of the former. So we've been drafting, what the registration, like, what would we expect for the DAO to publicly disclose to substitute a registration requirement. So here again, now looking outside of the legal terrain and looking at it more of what is it that, let's say, those who are building DAOs want, one of the things is that they don't want to have a registration requirement of having to actually go to a state authority and having to receive a seal. Instead, they try to find like a functional equivalent of this and see that, okay, if the purpose is, for instance, publicity and transparency, then can we do other things on chain and perhaps in some cases also off chain to be able to meet these requirements? And so this whole process of drafting this model law has involved first trying to understand, for instance, why do we have, let's say, a registration requirement in the corporate law systems of multiple jurisdictions. And once you unpack that, you then say that, okay, can there be other ways of achieving this? And then, of course, can we phrase it persuasively enough that a state would say, okay, I am convinced that yes, this can be a substitute. We are, of course, I think realistic enough to understand that there's always going to be pushback to an idea like this. But like that's by this through this fairly brief overview, I try to give like a lot of the thought process that's been going into this in our almost weekly discussions on this law. Yeah.
Morsha, that's so interesting because we were just addressing the same with a couple of people, and possibly will be joined by the Bank of Slovenia and the tax authority, because the tax authority kind of wants to present a new law for lowering the amount of taxes that needs to be paid on crypto.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of DAOs came to the surface, and what people were suggesting is that the tax still remains low, and the whole process of creating or licensing or registering as a company should not really be the same, just because these types of companies today are more or less startups. And if they're startups, I mean, they might have the same characteristics as any other stock company, but it's not really a stock company, because if you want to be a stock company and you want to register, the requirements for the capital are much, much higher. And usually to create that type of a company, it takes a lot more. And you promise the investors a lot more as well. So I'm just like curious, what is your perspective on that? Are you regarding DAOs more or less like startup companies, or do you see it as, it might as well be a digital twin of something that we already see in traditional world?
I think what's interesting about this is partly about whether, and this feeds into the discussion we've been having during the mornings, right? About at a sort of more abstract level, is about whether the idea of what DAOs are is based on what already exists or what might exist. So whether it's something that's empirically already observable, or something that DAOs might be doing in the near to midterm future. So if we're only looking at DAOs as something like basically, let's say like DAOs are, let's say, mainly in the field of some form of finance, then I think it's a different way of looking at it, as opposed to it being used for a broader range of purposes outside of just the financial world. At least that's how I think it influences how we look at it, because obviously, let's say legal entities that are subject to financial regulation are subject to different sorts of requirements than those that are not subject to financial regulation. And so the analogy with startups would also differ accordingly, because it's one way to say that, okay, a tech startup or many of the startups we would be talking about, many of them might not necessarily be in the financial space, right? And so the incentives that go into it, the sort of the controls that go into it might be would be different than with a financially oriented, like a fintech startup. So I think the sector is a bit important in drawing this analogy. The other is, and this has come up already in the commentary that we've been writing to this model law, is that there's in certain respects similarities between DAOs with publicly distributed, publicly distributed stock companies. So what in the UK would be something like a listed company, in the sense that that's what they are trying to achieve by being able to have like a wide distribution of ownership. But then in other respects, it's more similar to a partnership or to a a closely held company. It's because of the fact that there isn't like a uniformity yet about how they go about it. And I think this is one of the dilemmas, is something that's a hybrid of both as well, if you look at it in terms of ownership structure. So but in short, it would be, I think we need to differentiate a little bit about in terms of sector, and in terms of acknowledging that it might be a hybrid between somewhere between being a closely held and a publicly held or openly held entity. Yeah. Because, and I think the implications of this are that if we think of a lot of startups as being, closely held for a lot of their life cycle, in the sense that, it would be a group of founders, maybe some employees, and, some whoever is an external investor to it. And that, yes, some of them do eventually IPO, but the empirical evidence shows that many of them do not, and many of them instead actually just get acquired by either a competitor or someone else. And as a consequence of this, like it isn't necessarily going to ever lead to it becoming publicly held, like a startup. And so in the same way, you would think that, well, if you're going to call yourself a DAO, then one of the objectives should be to become have like publicly distributed ownership. If you don't have that as an objective, or if that's not really one of the ends you have in mind, then that's also a question of why would you use a DAO at all, or why would you want to be a DAO when you have already very solid legal entity forms, whether it's in Slovenia or wherever else in the world, right? I actually don't know if I'm at liberty to share a draft of the model law, but I will wait to see what others think. But obviously, otherwise that might be helpful in this discussion too.
How far away are you? I mean, how far away from the finishing of the model law are you? Because this has been an ongoing conversation for, is it almost a year?
I think we have about I think the last two chapters, let's say, of the model law needs to be finished. The commentary is really at a rough stage, because with some articles we had a lot of discussion. We have quite extensive notes about how we came up with a particular article and trying to justify it, while leaving scope for I would say like reasonable disagreement, where if someone pushes back and says, we don't agree with how this is phrased, we can at least point to say that this is our thought process behind why we drafted it in this way. And I think that's important for accountability and hopefully legitimacy at some point later on as well. But that part is going to take much longer. Like, I don't think that will be done this year. Our aim, at least, I mean, if it goes to plan, our aim was initially to try to do it, to finish it this year. But we will see. I mean, this is really like a project where we're relying on the input of many different people, and it depends on their schedules of whether they are available or not.
And then,
but yeah, exactly. Like, it's a travel repertoire. Yeah.
And I gotta ask you, because Andrea didn't know about it, but UNCITRAL, their model law on electronic transactions, or matter, about
yeah.
it.
Yeah. Like, I mean, one of the things I did at the beginning, I remember when we started this in drafting this in full swing earlier this year, was that we had a presentation and discussion on model laws. So the efforts of UNCITRAL in many different respects, I think, is relevant, because you have and this is the thing with the part that is about whether this falls within private international law or substantive corporate law, is that a lot of the UNCITRAL model laws don't try to shape substantive law so much as find a way of having a certain, let's say, instrument or a certain type of procedure being recognized in multiple systems, right? But having said that, there are instruments that UNCITRAL and UNIDROIT and others have published, which are more substantive in nature. So for instance, with their work on insolvency law, their work on group insolvency is more substantive than some of their earlier work on cross-border insolvency. They've been working on micro, small, and medium enterprise model laws as well. And I think in a way, those are also relevant, because if we think of crypto not just as being like something out there, but as maybe even a part of the informal economy, which is not usually the way it's phrased, but this whole work that they've been doing on MSMEs is very relevant for this thought process of how do you formalize an informal sector. And how do you do this while being sensitive to the needs of those involved in that sector, right? That was something we talked about, I think, yesterday when we were talking about Hernando de Soto and stuff. And the part about the part about what you just mentioned, also came up because of the fact that it also addresses this point about, recognition across several states. And here our question is also, who do we, and this relates to what Chris was saying, who do we approach to adopt this? Whether it's something like UNCITRAL, or is it ELI, or is it some other body that we would approach to, again, give this more legitimacy or not? This, again, depends a little bit on what, hopefully, what kind of feedback we get, basically, because our idea is that once we finish a first draft, we would then we would present this to a wider group to receive, critical comments and suggestions. And so then when it's a bit more refined, we can share this with these bodies. And I know that Chris has worked with the ELI. Primavera, of course, has worked with the ELI as well as with the OECD and so on. And while that doesn't necessarily translate into anything in terms of acceptance of this model law, it does mean that our hope is that there are these bodies which are working on model laws that would be good critical sounding boards for us. Yeah.
And
would you like to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say the ELI program on smart contracts is continuing. So
yeah,
we're still having sessions. We've still got an excellent opportunity to give input, and obviously the Commission is well, they're pushing ahead with all sorts of ambitious things. So they're keen to take input.
So sorry, I feel like I've been talking a lot. Like, I'd like to hear what others have to say about this. Sorry.
It's been very useful, Moshe. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't been hearing a lot about the model laws provisions, but yeah, it's interesting to hear that this is going to be represented to a lot of international organizations. I actually wonder whether you guys are, invested into having a campaign, almost sort of a thing. Like we were just speaking to Ecosite, to Jojo Mikta, and they are trying to create this law, or kind of suggest it to all the nation states to implement their own laws about that would allow people to be prosecuted in front of the International Criminal Court for damaging the environment. And how they have actually approached the whole thing was they opened up a lot of political discourses. They had a huge campaign, and they are lobbying within every single jurisdiction. But the biggest part that played part in their success was basically the narrative building, the storytelling, the campaign. So I'm just curious whether this is also something that crypto seems to be invested into, or is it like a group of lawyers advocating between lawyers? And is it really just about, approaching the international legal associations or people like that?
I'm curious to hear if Anuj has any comments on this, because basically, like, I think the idea is that this has this is linked to this discussion we were having about positive rights and negative rights before, because I think that part of the idea of building a narrative for a campaign is to have some sort of like a positive message that surrounds it, rather than just being about we want freedom from this, this, and this, and that's why we are trying to change the laws for this. I think that can become harder to mobilize people around. I think we are not, to be honest, like we are not there yet for a campaign. I think we are still at the stage where within still like not a small group of people we're working on this, and then we have to go to the next step of having input from a wider group, not just from people who are lawyers, but hopefully or not even just lawyers and people who work in blockchain specifically, but also more widely too. Like I'm curious to see whether this would be something that people feel that would be in general a good legal reform, not just specifically for advancing a particular crypto sector or something. What do you think, Anuj?
Anuj.
That's a nice move, putting the. I was just trying to be lazy and listen to all the awesome stuff that you were talking about, just learning and not providing any input. But no, I think I mean, I was initially involved with the DAO model, and then life happened. I got caught up with other stuff. But I think what you're saying now is the adoption. You have to be very careful and even maybe not overdo the adoption drive. Because sometimes, as you know, what happens if you overdo these kinds of things. There's already a lot of cynicism around crypto, and not just in law, but I think Moshe and I had previously talked. There is a lot of cynicism in mainstream academy world also, especially in social sciences around. So you have to always be careful not to sound as if you want to carve out a space for crypto in a way that it is not liable or it is unresponsible in the way the other things are. So I think that's why the freedom from unnecessary regulations, for example, which I know Qual is not that, but would be important to stress, because people who don't know crypto, don't know Quala, might not know, because I mean, from the outside, people have that kind of rhetoric about crypto that either they don't want any interactions, with the regulation, or if they do, they want some sort of a sanction where the regulation will be like, okay, you have a sandbox, do what you want. It's not that what our model is, right? So I think it'll be interesting to see how they can play the freedom to do this new innovative things that are good for stakeholders involved, dancing freedom from. And that yeah, I don't know if that's what you meant, Moshe, when you were saying that.
Chris, what do you think?
I struggle always with the topic, because I don't know what it's for yet. So I struggle to figure out how I want it to be until I know what it's for. So I'm still waiting really to get a sense of what DAOs are for.
That is so interesting. I mean, you guys are talking about the same thing, because Moshe, you just mentioned that you are yet to see if there are any positive rights. And that is very much just what Chris was saying. You struggle with what DAOs are actually for, and Moshe struggles with what are the positive rights. Is that?
Yeah, well, it's because I can't make sense of. I think DAOs make sense if you approach it from a kind of neoliberal, like markets should rule the world perspective. If you think you can solve everything with if you think you can solve everything with wisdom of crowds and market forces, then you're just like, well, of course we're going to use DAOs to solve whatever problems we need to solve, because DAOs allow us to implement the market mechanisms that we think are the universal toolbox. Whereas if you're just generally skeptical about that whole approach, it's harder to understand what DAOs are for.
Am I being illusioned when I think about crypto being a very good alternative to the monetary systems and the monetary politics, especially the fiscal policy, which is being implemented in countries that are still like ex-colonial countries? So for example, you have Haiti and you have a lot of African countries that are still every year paying a huge amount of money to France. And you do have a couple of countries that are still paying a huge amount of money to Netherlands or UK or whatever countries they were previously being under, be it either the protectorate or whatever the relationship between those countries were. But basically, I mean, to me, it's like that. If the government all of a sudden decides that they no longer want to pay that tax or they no longer want to pay that fund to ex-colonial power, then of course there's going to be a huge amount of sanctions being implemented, be it political, economical sanctions. Either way, there's going to be, they will struggle with diplomatic relationship that they have built so far. However, if you think about what the alternative might be, is that there's an alternative market in place. Meaning, if we have a global crypto system right now being developed, which can handle its own monetary and fiscal policies, and a stablecoin, for example, is being used on the individual basis, so it's not really the government is advocating for it, but it's literally like the individuals are adopting it, then this presents a very interesting, positively directed solution that could be part of that market.
Yeah, I see that. I think DAOs are just badly named. They're not distributed autonomous organizations. They should be called DAMs. They're distributed autonomous markets. You know, I don't know. You know me, I like codes, but you know, firm versus market, organization versus market. You know, it's two very different ways to approach something. DAOs have none of the features of the organization and all of the features of the market. So DAOs aren't organizations at all. You know, it's no good saying, oh, well, we want to substitute for organizations with markets. I mean, yeah, fair point. That's your choice. That's the Cozian choice. You know, it's almost 100 years old, well, 85, 84 years old, whatever, his paper. You know, we've had that choice for a long time. There's nothing very exciting or new about choosing between
yeah, if you agree with that, I just had this discussion workshop with Ross Campbell, and it was something that I never thought about, but he was saying a DAO can be, you know, just a wallet that is held by a family members. So it's like just like, sorry?
Like a multi-sig?
That's the sole use case for smart contracts, right? They're multi-sig wallets. That's all they do. So of course you can use it for that. That's the only thing you can use it for.
Exactly. But this is I think #1 use case, and like a very basic and easy one, because we don't have the bank to, you know, restore our funds when we lose them. But what you were saying, okay, this is a market, but when you connect it to an organization, like of course they are doing, and you know the LAO is doing, and all the other similar organizations, it is an organization, because you leave the market out of it because it's just, you know, connected to a legal entity. But yeah, I do agree with you on this. You know, DAO without a link.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I sort of concede the point on, like, there's not just two categories here, organization or market. There's organization or market or other. And, you know, multi-sig wallets falls in the other category. That's a useful tool. And, you know, that's great. But a lot of the more elaborate DAOs that are created, like they're kind of markets of a sort. Markets for, you know, proposed allocation of resources and voting on the allocation of those resources. You know, it's more like, you know, whether it's actually a prediction market or not. It's all sort of market dynamics for kind of group decision making over allocation of resource.
I think what, sorry, no, go ahead.
But I would kind of change the topic, so maybe you should go ahead first.
Oh, I was just going to add that I think what we're seeing now, and where this markets and firm issue becomes becomes alive again, is the fact that you end up having persons who are interested in creating a DAO building elaborate off-chain governance mechanisms for how they end up doing things on-chain, which then raises the question about, well, if you look at the whole system as a both on-chain and off-chain, then really both the DAO itself maybe has a very limited function within their overall organization, and so it's a market within a larger organization, and thus like it's not really this unencumbered market at all anymore. And
it's not autonomous. It's
exactly.
Autonomous.
And so then it just becomes a DOE or something like that. Like, or I
Oh,
mean,
it's an acronym.
I mean, the acronym's been problematic, I think, from the beginning, right? Like, I mean, I also.
I'm happy with DAM or DOE.
Yeah.
Either of those works for me.
And also, as you know, like a company or a firm, or when you work together, it's always more than accounting. So many times what happens is it gets conflated, like as if you can have some fancy way of doing accounting. That kind of, even like the idea of governance by way of accounting, which is the DAO style, it's not really governance. It's like a very neoliberal idea of like if people had the final vote on something, that's all the governance, but not all the conversations, the critiques, all the things that not even cannot be recorded, like all the oral things that go on in a governance, for example, all the cultural norms that go on, that cannot be tokenized at all. So, I mean, in one way, I would say, if I understand you correctly, Chris, that when Anya, you said about the Haiti and others, which is interesting because it's almost like thinking that the neoliberal world that, for example, say, I mean, it's problematic terms, let's say, first world countries dominate, it's using neoliberalism against them to defeat them at their own game, like by creating an alternative neoliberal paradigm, which crypto will usher in. And maybe we might want to consider, maybe this game is rigged always, just by creating an alternative neoliberal paradigm, DAOs, crypto, and all that will not just get us there. I don't know. I'm just thinking that might be one way to take it.
I'm thinking how much a DAO is connected to crypto assets, and I'm thinking about again the new regulation on crypto assets that we have in Europe. That means that if the DAO is not regulated within the scope of the new proposed regulation. I think this is the first very clear sign after the DAO's existence that you cannot have crypto assets in a way that it will be designed in the future within this legal framework that is proposed right now. But it needs to be, incorporated, an organization that is incorporated in Europe. And of course, we had a really interesting discussion this morning about Vlad having and thinking about alternatives to that and how can this actually be enforced? Can it be enforced or not? But I think this is like the first very clear rule.
But then, okay, so if something needs to be incorporated, because this is the same as if I'm having crypto and I need to register it as an activity that I do for a business.
Mm-hmm.
So the regulation needs to provide me with a framework in which I can fit. But with a DAO and with all these crypto assets, the beauty of them is that because it's a bunch of data that can be not collateral, that's a bad expression, but like a bunch of that data that I can congregate, connect to each other, I'm now creating assets that have much more of a value than any of the assets that we have previously been able to describe and then regulate. Because all of a sudden I can have a token that represents my employment contract, that represents a stock, that represents a vote right, that represents a lot of different things in one basket.
Mm-hmm.
So how are we going to be having a requirement that I need to incorporate if I don't even know what exactly it is that I'm incorporating? Like, it's a bunch of different.
You will need to know. You will need to know upfront. And if you don't know, you'll just incorporate by the things you know. And then when you want to do something new, you'll just need to be, again, meeting these new requirements.
Morshad, I need your brains on this as well. I totally hear Marina when she says we need new requirements, but it's the model.
I mean, strictly, I think someone was someone trying to say something? No, I think Anuj was saying bye. Bye.
Bye.
I think one way that some try to deal with this, but I'm actually not sure how this would work when it comes to a business that's in the financial sector again, because basically with a company, you can obviously draft your objects, for instance, in a broad enough way where you can essentially carry out any other activity as well that falls broadly within the scope of what you have already been doing. So if you are, if it's something that's involves, let's say, regarding digital assets or something already, then let's say there's some sort of new type of activity that you want to do. If you phrased your purposes broadly enough, you should be able to still fall within that without, doing some sort of ultra vires activity. Obviously, I'm assuming that you have like this concept of ultra vires at all. I mean, not all systems do. But again, I think the issue then, of course, comes that if there is another area of regulation which then says that no, this particular type of activity is not permissible unless you do another type of registration. And I think then it's not, again, really like about organizational law at all, but is about another, it is from another framework altogether. So that's the dilemma. I mean, like Chris, I remember having like great conversations with Chris about, like basically how you can look at property in a very like creative way. I mean, the whole idea with, I think the way I understood Materium was looking at it in a way where you are trying to stretch what should already be possible with the law to be able to encompass what technology is now being able to do. And that's, I think, so, like convincing a third person who comes at it from outside about this is often what ends up becoming the challenge. Because if they have like a particular type of intent, about how they see this, then it prejudices you a bit. But if they come with like with a different sort of intent, I would imagine that it's it's possible to if you fit it within whatever you're already what is already happening. I think like the fact that with a lot of places where you have like this for a long time, you've had this very quiet approach, like, wait and see type of approach to regulation is partly based on this, right? What is this? What if we see it as a financial?
No, because we're talking about licenses here. And they have these 4 or 6 types of tokens.
Yeah.
The definition of a token in this regulation is terrible because it's super broad. And yeah, it might help with the argumentation that you were talking about before, but it's just the first one. We don't have any, use cases that we can look at. And if they see something as a financial instrument, I don't think you can be very creative here.
Yeah.
So to some extent, I mean, I'm really curious what you guys think about it, but to some extent, it kind of seems as if we have all these different regulations that apply to different instruments, and then we have Bitcoin, and we are trying to subsume Bitcoin or whatever cryptocurrencies we have or whatever assets we have under each and one of them. And then if it fits, then we have to comply. If it fits here, we have to comply. If it fits everywhere, we have to comply with everything. And to me, it almost seems as if in the future, we're approaching the concept that is reverse. You first have crypto assets, you first have cryptography, and then if it fits under one of these regulations, then the crypto asset also gets this type of a characteristic. So it's a reverse situation.
I think, I mean, many people were asking themselves if a new Bitcoin is possible under this regulation, because it's probably not going to be. And I think this is a really good question, Anya, because it's like, how can you predict what you're going to do and what is your like really innovative experience going to lead you to know right now how much money you need to spend on licensing?
Yeah.
And that is the big, I mean, problem here, because it really, you know, it's not good for innovation. and also, I mean, the US was really clear, was like substantial, what was saying, decentralization, which was achieved just by Bitcoin and Ethereum. So my question is any other, you know, blockchain or token going to achieve the level of decentralization that they did?
Oh, so you end up getting caught in a loop, I guess, because of the fact that you need to be decentralized, but you're not allowed to get to the stage where you are decentralized.
Yeah. That's why they had these ideas that you have a 3-year period when, you know, within which you can become decentralized, and then they will just take a look at you and analyze you in 3 years. But it's...
Yeah. I think Michael wanted to say something. He wrote a comment that I think more cryptocurrency is possible with the emergence of more digital banks. Would you like to introduce yourself, Michael, and share what your thoughts are?
Hello. Well, I do not know much about cryptocurrency, but I've been realizing that it seems like from 2000-ish onwards, it's like with the emergence of like cryptocurrencies, there's also the rise of like a lot of technologies that help facilitate digital currencies. So like fintech, like financial technologies, and also like more companies are willing to go into digital banking or having a digital bank license to actually regulate cash flows and, you know, money transfer between different in cross boundary payments and etc. So I'm just like, perhaps in future, I mean, with this, they might add more value into cryptocurrency, because I mean, Facebook is already creating their own. Cybersecurity companies are using that as a way to protect digital and financial assets, and perhaps maybe with this, people can develop more reliable cryptocurrencies. That's my thoughts. I'm not an expert. Yeah.
No. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
No problem.
Yeah, there's definitely a discussion about more and more banks introducing the digital currencies, and then the adoption rates. I was just having a conversation yesterday with people here in the house, how, for example, the adoption affects the usual cryptocurrency and how it does not really affect the price of a stable coin. It's hard for people to understand that stable coins are actually the ones that might be, you know, used for, I don't know, buying a coffee in crypto. Might be much better, because if I earn the money 3 years ago, then the price is not really going to be changed much. While if I just pay with a regular, like whichever currency, I might be making money 3 years ago, but today I might be minus, basically, like drop to zero. Like, what am I going to be paying the coffee with then?
Yeah. Yeah. Go ahead, sorry.
No, please continue. My question was just if we know anything about the work we did with Koala on the DAO.
On the model law?
Yeah.
Oh, I spent some time talking about it at the beginning.
Oh, okay, cool. I'll see the recording. Thank you.
Yeah, Murshid, Chris, what are the next steps that you're going to do, if you guys can share actually?
Well, I mean, I'm waiting to hear what it's for in terms of the model law, and if once I get a coherent answer to that, then I may be able to help. But if we never reach a coherent answer to that, I won't be able to help.
Who do you think you can hear the answer from?
Well, there's a bunch of smart people working on it, and I'm sure someone at some point is going to tell me what it's for.
Silke?
I think the idea that the issue is like why I wouldn't be able to give a single answer to it is because I don't think there is a single answer to that yet, in terms of why people are invested in this and why people are working on this every week. I think, as I said, like some people are trying to deal with this as a way of dealing with the liability question, and that really guides what they're trying to do. Is, you know, we have this issue that we can end up having DAOs being, you know, treated as a general partnership, or that someone is held to be a fiduciary, so on and so forth. And that's, I think, one motivator. I don't know if that is a sufficient motivator, but that is one. I think another driver would be the idea that, and this is maybe a bit more idealistic, but whether it's possible to create like organizations that are born global rather than those which are born in a local environment and then have to deal with the um, the challenges of having to then become globally dispersed. I think the issue with this, again, is that a lot of the problems with being, you know, born global are not really things you can solve with corporate law, but are actually more prosaic issues about things like social security law, tax law, and things like this. So, for instance, if you are a member of a DAO, working for a DAO, let's say not an investor, but you actually work for it, and you're in one jurisdiction, it could be that it affects your particular status might affect what kind of health insurance you're required to have, or it could affect your tax status. And or, you know, of course, we talked about sanctions earlier in this summit. It could affect whether you fall foul of a sanction, depending on what your nationality is. So these sorts of things end up becoming an important factor, which no one can really hope to solve. But I think this is the idea is to try to think of how can we do this, and how can we do this better than prior attempts at creating these sorts of organizations, looking at the history as well of trying to create these organizations. I think
why did you say idealistic?
I say idealistic because of the fact that maybe it's, I don't mean that necessarily in the negative sense, because I guess I'm one of the people who hold that ideal a bit quite closely. But I think it's because of the fact that if we look at the attempts in the past at, for instance, people trying to create, whether it's a cooperative or whether it's a normal stock corporation, but it's created in a way to be democratically run, let's say. And it also to be globally dispersed, is that the previous attempts at this have always struggled, for instance, because of democratic degeneration, because they found that, okay, it works for 15 people, it works for 20 people. Once you go above that, it stops working, and you end up losing member involvement. And what's interesting, I mean, and this is where the potential, but also the great risk, I guess, of all of this is the fact that you could potentially address some of these coordination challenges using a DAO, but at the same time, you could also exacerbate some of the asymmetries. It's one of the reasons why it's so important to study this, is to try to understand how can they be used and how can they not be used. It's one of the reasons why, outside of like this whole neoliberal and libertarian space, I mean, there are a lot of, community currencies that are trying to explore how they can use blockchain. There are those who are running cooperatives in Kerala or somewhere who are trying to think of how can they use blockchain as well, because they see that there can be something there, but it's not tested yet. And that's exactly the reason why it's worth investigating these questions and trying to really, find out, okay, where, what haven't I thought of yet? And by talking to more people with different sorts of backgrounds, I think that gives more clarity about this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so of course, and this is the most obvious one. I forgot that. The third one is obviously is just to create is for those who are interested in just seeing more DAOs, because they've been working on this issue for a long time, and so they're like, it's almost like as a principle. That's not really an economic argument. It's more just because it's a sunk cost or something.
Right. That's psychological.
Yeah.
Psychological flaw. Yeah. Well, there's no point in me sharing. You already know my views, but it's inherently implausible to me that you solve, cognitive and systemic limitations on group decision making or information processing. Like the problems are cognitive and systemic. You don't solve them by saying market forces, woo. It's like, no, that wasn't the problem in the first place. It's only if you adopt the ideology that you would try and solve every problem with that approach.
Yeah. Sorry.
What about existing, because what you were previously describing, right, the services or the markets that are by default global. So for example, you have Twitch, which is offering services to a global audience, and they have their own bits. And then you have lots of games that are using their own game tokens. And those are like a bit bizarre examples. Or perhaps you take a look at the Upwork, which is an employment platform where everybody can actually get their job, and then they are basically the ones responsible for the taxes, because how it works is you have to be a freelancer, and then you kind of have the obligation to take care of your own taxes and your own accountancy, and it's like the burden for taking care of those social standards or the standards to comply with your national regulation is really up to one specific user and not really up to the platform. So, I mean, is that the future? Are these organizations and these companies going to be switching to decentralized models? And why haven't they already? Because they are now operating.
That's exactly the question. Is that because they already are able to do this without having to switch? And I mean, if they're able to, for instance, that's at least one. I think they would need to have a very strong reason to have to switch if they're able to already provide this service to a globally distributed community, right?
So the question would be, I mean, I don't think that they will ever invest into something like that, because to come to the point where they are today, they've already invested heavily into having it, legally compliant and into having everything functionable. But like, it's not really in their best interest, but it is in the best interest of all the users. So if Upwork would all of a sudden actually be using crypto, it might actually be serving me much better, especially if the crypto would be more and more adopted in the world. But right now, it's like Upwork by itself will never be making this type of an investment unless they would start all over again.
I mean, I think like you do have examples of, for instance, Colony or DAOstack or Aragon, who have talked about basically creating a freelancers marketplace using their, you create like a freelancers DAO on Aragon or on Colony or so on. Like that's like been discussed before as well. And I think then you would think of this, that if it worked, it would be like an alternative to something like Upwork. The question then is what is this alternative providing that the others were not? So hypothetically, or if we think of it as an ideal type, we can imagine that perhaps something like Upwork, you don't, as a freelancer, have much of a say in how how Upwork as a website, how Upwork as a company operates, right? And you don't have a say in like, if Upwork as a company is making profits, you are not going to be, what do you call it, getting a share of that profit. And so here the idea is that, well, if you're using a distributed version, maybe it's possible that at the end of of a year, you are not only getting your like not only getting a single stream of income as a freelancer, but you might also get it as some form of owner or token holder. I think that's like one idea, and the other is the voice aspect of this. But I think again, the question is whether this would be sufficient to encourage people to switch these sorts of benefits, and whether it would already have to grow to a certain size before encouraging that switch, because you end up still having this network effect problem, right? You end up still having that you don't have enough freelancers versus what do you call it, like those who are actually posting work. So
I think it's very connected to kind of the philosophy of the organization. And I think there was this when we had this Twitter problem, that the hack, and there were so many people saying, okay, Twitter could have prevented this because they should invest more in the privacy settings and whatever they're doing in safety. But they didn't, because their number one goal is profit. So if those are organizations that their number one goal is not something that the DAO does, I don't think they're going to use that. And on the other hand, is also from the user's perspective, are those technologies developed enough that this big number of users could actually do that? Thinking about gas prices right now, like there's so many things that make it so really hard to use and to do a Twitch on Ethereum, that also from the technical perspective, we might not be ready right now.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think, like Chris, I'm sorry that we can't give you like a more exciting answer or a concrete answer yet, but I don't feel comfortable giving a single answer to that yet either.
No, I think that's entirely fair. I wouldn't necessarily expect a single answer.
Yeah.
I mean, hopefully there will be multiple use cases.
And I feel it's been a really interesting exercise as well to work on this, because it's not only like because at least one of the things that I will say, even though I don't know if I'm in a position to share it, the link on something that's being recorded, but the idea is that we do have a lot of accountability with each other, where if we write something, usually we write it as a suggestion, and then someone comments or asks, why did you frame it in this way? And as I said, like, we end up having this commentary where we have to explain choices we make, especially when it involves an either or situation. And hopefully, if there is pushback later, we can then go back and look at it and say that, okay, this is what we did. Maybe we need to rethink, or we didn't understand something as well as we should.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're creating your own chain of evidences, Marshall.
I hope so. I think, like, for instance, one of the questions we are now coming to and I'm very curious to hear this in the few minutes we have left, is about issues that are still quite hypothetical, but any instrument that hopes to talk about an entity like this would have to deal with. is questions like, what do you do when DAOs want to merge with each other? Is that something that would ever happen? Is that, or is it something that is sort of not even an issue here? And the other is the idea of what happens when you want to disband a DAO, however you call it. Is that also possible? Or should it be possible? And so let's say once a DAO has fulfilled its purpose, do you force it to distribute whatever assets it has left to token holders or to a third entity or party? That's, yeah.
Great questions. Yeah,
I mean, it kind of happens to one of the startups that got money through an ICO, and then actually it was not a DAO, but all the users and the holders decided that they want the money back, and they just got the money back. They left 2 to 3 millions to the company.
Mm-hmm. So that was an example of what, rage quitting? Or
that was an example of, I mean, it was really interesting because their equity tokens, they just
withdrew it.
No, they switched them to shares. So you can just exchange it to shares or just, get your money back. And these shareholders, they had it was a very interesting, no, I think they actually agreed on it on Telegram, whatever. But it's a very interesting group of people that is very, democratized in a way. A lot of people had a small amount of shares, and they actually drew the decision making. And they said, we want the money back, and it's enough for you to have 2 to 3 million euros. And that would never happen in a, classic setting.
Yeah. And that's the question, right? Like whether this is the empirics of this, like what is already happening, is what should become the norm, like, or whether we should say something else, that this is not the socially desirable outcome, and that we should specify something else instead. That's, I think, something was, and this is an ongoing dilemma as well, because it's one thing, because we're sort of inductively creating a law by looking at what is happening. You end up having this issue that you're only really trying to describe what is, and trying to say this is what is the is the way that it should be. But it at the same time, we're also trying to specify that, okay, in certain respects, we want certain norms to change. And I think that's also the question with respect to, what you're describing, is that should it be like this, or should we try to change that something like this does not happen?
Yeah, what is actually good for the company? Are we doing what we need to do for the company, or are we doing something that is good for the whole society? I don't know.
Well, even if you look at just a company, right? Like this sort of withdrawal, like we had a little bit of this conversation with respect to withdrawals, right? Mm-hmm. Where with a normal limited liability company, you cannot withdraw the amount that has been invested. You can only transfer your share to someone else. Mm-hmm. And then again, there are limits to transferability depending on the nature of the company. With certain types of cooperatives, you can withdraw the whole sum, just like you can from a withdraw, like whatever you've invested in a DAO. But then usually what the law does is saying that you cannot withdraw it immediately. You have to withdraw it after a year, 2 years, if depending on the solvency of the entity. Here, there is no concept of this. And so, like, as you said, like there's this arbitrary idea that if it's 2 to 3 million euros, which is not the same as like some sort of benchmark that you have. And so then the question comes that, okay, do we introduce something like debt ratios like you have or solvency ratios that you have with respect to, sorry, I was just reading the comments. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's actually a good question. What is the probability of a DAO getting hacked?
Oh, you're pointing to the DAO hack. Yeah. There's I think a very readable and fun one that I think I recommend to everyone to read about the DAO hack is Quinn DuPont's article about this. He wrote like an ethnographic take on the DAO hack, which is so fun because it's written like, I mean, I think anyone could read it and find it interesting. Like, it's not a lawyer's thing or anything like. Let me see. I think there's like a link that's just available online.
And also Vera, Naomi, Carlos, Michael, if you have any questions, please unmute yourself. This is an open discussion, so you're welcome to present your comments, viewpoints, or whatever you have, even questions. I think we have experts here that will be able to answer a lot of different questions with regard to DAOs or crypto.
Sorry, sorry, pardon me. I think, sorry, I just know, now I know what is the exact word for DAO, but I know like because there's a lot of cybersecurity issues surrounding crypto. So especially with DAO, there was, I mean, like the 2016 one, the DAO crisis, that hacking scandal that actually caused like people's confidence to drop really badly. Is there like a possibility of like something much more advanced than DAO or alternative like Lao actually? Like, from what I heard, Lao is similar, but it's on a limited structure.
Yeah, so the DAO is basically a Lao is one type of a DAO. Basically, it's the DAO that has been created by open law, and it applies to the legal contracts. They claim, and they have already made a couple of smart contracts that now can be used in particularly for legal applications or for almost like a legal technical design. And I think that they use the law for distributing the proceedings that they get from their clients, I think, or for basically distributing the funds among their employees. Not sure about that. I would have to double check that, but it's their particular DAO. So they do call themselves a decentralized autonomous organization because I think that they run their own governance and take decisions within a DAO that they have created. Marina, you've been there. Maybe you can add on top of that.
Yeah, I think Michael was there, if I'm not mistaken, for some time. So I think, yeah, we had a really nice presentation of what we're talking about laws, but also like smart contracts in general and how we can use them. I think it was really cool because at the end of the day, Ross said, showed us the secret to become a legal engineer. And yeah, I think this is cool for lawyers to learn that.
Pretty awesome. We also had Aaron Wright explaining to us what open law does. So Michael, if you have access to it, please take a look at the replay as soon as it's going to be available. And I'm seeing comments that Moshe is also making. Oh yeah, do you want to say some more?
Oh no, nothing. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
A history of ethnography. I don't know how to pronounce that. Of the DAO of a decentralized autonomous organization. Cool.
He's always like a great person to read about like blockchain and cryptocurrency in general.
That's
Quinn DuPont.
This looks cool.
Yeah, Quinn DuPont is awesome to read, absolutely. All right, I didn't know that exists. Cool.
But I think like one aspect of it, which is interesting with a hack, is obviously the discussion about whether this hack is a hack, in the sense that you had the group who didn't think that this was a hack. So
don't even go there, more.
I mean, no. I mean, like it's important for like when Michael brings up this discussion is, you know, this is the sort of issue that, I mean, a lot of people don't. I mean, now it's been more than 4 years. Like it's not even. It's like an old discussion, but it's one that took place at the time. And it sort of also shows a little bit of the sort of mindset that goes into approaching these questions of even that is even relevant for cybersecurity is about, it's almost as if there is a problem with it, it's your fault that there is a problem with it. And that's, you know, and that, so, you know, it's really, and I've noticed, and this is actually relevant for the model law question too. I know that some people prefer to look at the model law as a type of, and interactions with DAOs generally as being a buyer beware type of interaction, where it's not as if, like, it's almost as if a lot of these principles that we have in the law about good faith or acting in a certain way with someone who you're doing business with, it's almost like eliminated in this concept. And it's rather that, okay, any interaction, and it's not just an investment interaction, any interaction with a DAO should always be knowing that, okay, I might lose everything that I've been doing in this way. And this is like almost like a deliberate a choice where it's saying that, okay, you need to know the risks, and we are going to tell you more of the risks that are involved and be more transparent about it, but you should know this, and that's why you have a duty to inform yourself and educate yourself enough to do this. This is a threshold that's much higher than with a company, right? When you interact with a business.
That's a bit much, though. I mean, because that would mean that everybody gets to bear the responsibility of knowing how much they risk just because this is a new alternative financial instrument. I don't know. I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, but
no, I mean, this is not an agreed point either. Like, it's just one of the things that came up.
Because what happened with the DAO hack, I mean, I was so surprised to read the stories about it. Like, the hacker literally published a letter thanking everybody to make these viable, right? Because he was like looking at the code and he saw that code as, oh, the code is providing me with these nice features, so I'm just going to take the advantage of this feature. He did not ever see it as a bug. He actually saw it as somebody intentionally put it there so that I can exploit the code as is. And he thanked everybody, and then everybody was like, oh shit, we need to do something about it. Let's convene, let's discuss whether we are going to be creating a fork, whether we are going to be amending the code. And what popped my mind is that the way you are now creating the model law, like 2 times you actually said that you're making comments on the side just so that you enable yourself going back in time, seeing what was the intent that you had when you were crafting the text the way it is right now. And especially when it's a situation either or, you want to be very clear about what was the rationale behind it. So travail préparatoire applied to model law, absolutely, and it's something that lawyers are very familiar with, but I do believe that that should be something that developers get more familiar with as well, because you do have the possibility to put comments on the code. And if you have not been putting the comments on the code, or if you have explained the code in a certain way, then you can prevent people from further on in the future exploiting the code just because they never knew whether this is actually something that was not envisioned this way, or was it something that actually people wanted it to function that way. And we might as well just say, well, the code should be functioning in this way, and it should be allowing everybody to have distributed system that works in a specific manner. And if something goes 90% the opposite way, then we know that that should not be happening because we have named what the intent was in the first place.
But that's very interesting, because this is what Ross said, is he says that if lawyers manage smart contracts, we are kind of used to, manage something that might be risky in the future, or, think about risks and think about really high transactions. So that, that could be something we can maybe learn from each other.
Sorry. Well, maybe that's already happening, and I'm very
as we're coming to the end of the session. Like, I should point out that the model law isn't just being drafted by a bunch of lawyers from different places, but it does have developers and those who are not just even developers, but those who are building DAOs, who are working in one case even working for a DAO, who are involved and are using their experience to sort of feed back into things that wouldn't even become apparent until you're actually doing it in practice. And that's a great, this has been one of the really great aspects of working on this, is that you see how this changes and how having these discussions one-on-one or as a group leads to these amendments even, or even how the thinking process evolves accordingly.
Yeah,
that's pretty awesome. All right, guys, we have to stop at one point, but thank you everybody for coming. And yeah, it's been an amazing 5 days that we have put together. Morshed, it was an amazing workshop every single day that we woke up and we were thinking about it and brainstorming around different concepts. Notion is going to be made available to everybody if you agree. But yeah, I mean, thank you so much. I appreciate your devotion to all this project. I mean, it's a startup as well.